Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to your number one and favourite classic dirt bike TV station, where we continue to feature more of those old school vintage race bikes from way back in the day. Now, if you're a brand new subscriber to CDB TV, then welcome aboard, and I hope you continue to find material here on my channel with regards talking about and looking at these old vintage race bikes. So right now we're going to take a look at a bike that was launched in the early 1990s, and this was basically this manufacturer's last gasp attempt at trying to compete with the might of the big four Japanese manufacturers of their day. But unfortunately this bike fell way too short of the mark to try and do anything about the power of the Japanese bike. So we're going to delve right into that video now and take a look at this 1990 CZ 125 Type 519. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that we're all aware of the huge success story of the CZ dirt bikes of the 1960s and 1970s, when some of the world's top riders, including the likes of Roger De Coster, Dave Bickers, and even Joël Robert, all rode Czechoslovakian CZ bikes to great success. And during that golden era of Czechoslovakian domination, the CZ factory certainly notched up more than 13 world titles with their super quick and nimble two-stroke engines. But it's also said that those older Czechoslovakian race bikes of that era also played a major part in bringing and promoting motocross in not only Europe but in the USA as well. But as dirt bike racing then moved into the mid-1970s, more and more faster, lighter and less expensive bikes from Japan were beginning to flood the market, and hardened CZ owners were then ditching their Czechoslovakian European steeds for much better quality motorcycles from Japan. And as we moved on into the 1980s, CZ certainly tried their very best with brand new models, but no matter how hard they tried, they just couldn't compete with the quality and the quantity that Japan had to offer. But come the early 1990s, CZ did come up with a bike which, on the face of it, looked like it was a race winner, because it certainly looked the part and had all of the latest technology that the current modern day motocrossers had. But after a little scrutiny and a closer inspection of its working parts, the reality of their brand new model wasn't everything that it was cracked up to be. Which of course brings us to our featured bike, which is a 1990 CZ 125, which at that time was designated a Type 519 model. And this example here is a surprisingly stock machine that's not seen too much action on the racetrack during its life, but then again, you'll maybe understand why as we delve deeper into its working parts. But basically, this bike here was CZ's last throw off the dice to try and take on the big four Japanese manufacturers at their own game. And if they still wanted to be a major player in the off-road dirt bike motorcycle market, then this model here would have to tick all of the boxes to be competitive. So let's get started with the bike's chassis, which is manufactured from light gauge tubular steel, which started as a large diameter down tube at the front, which then split into two smaller diameter tubes that then ran underneath to cradle the motor. Now, the subframe was also made of tubular steel, which again was removable and bolted onto the back of the frame with a few bolts. But the chassis was just about strong enough to cope with most of the race conditions that the 125 would come across on its motocross travels. So as we move on to the bike's motor, which was actually a brand new design of engine for this 1990s motocrosser, which, to be fair, was quite well designed and engineered and compact, and certainly a lot of thought had gone into its construction and execution. And on the face of it, the motor looked to have everything that it required to be a race winner, but of course that was until the engine got fired up, because this motor was certainly no Honda CR125 rocket ship. But essentially the engine was a single cylinder liquid cooled motor that had a variable exhaust port power valve, and it was fed its fuel through a big flat slide 38mm Mikuni TMS carburetor. But earlier versions of this engine were fitted with that troublesome CZ Jikov carburetor that was fitted as standard, that really had a bad reputation for leaking and flooding, and that's why these Mikunis were then substituted in its place. And in fact, crankcase flooding on these 519s due to those old Jikov carburetors were so common on these engines that CZ even included a crankcase drain plug on this engine so that you could clean out the crankcases before firing up the motor. Now, also on the fuel side of the motor, the little 125 had a cage reed valve block to feed that fuel into the engine, just like most of the Japanese bikes of its day. And the airbox was made of plastic with a little rubber connecting pipe to mount the rear of the carburetor onto the airbox feed pipe. But one of the more crazy features of this CZ519 was that the Czechoslovakians decided to fit a paper cartridge filter into the airbox that looked like it came from an old vacuum cleaner, which of course when it got wet it just turned into mush. But what their thinking was there was quite weird, but probably it was all finance based. Now, our little 125mm was fitted with a 6-speed gearbox, and believe me, you needed every single gear on this motor to get it to work, because although this engine was quite well engineered and thought through, the power you got back in return was very tame. But in performance figures, these 519 125s, it said, would struggle to even pass a KX80 if it was racing on the same track. So it certainly wasn't the quickest 125 of its day, and some testers of the time stated that the motor's power was more along the lines of the power of a leaf blower rather than an actual competitive 125 motocross racer. And some of the other bolt-on parts of the engine, including the kickstarter and gear shifter, were all made of steel rather than lighter alloy, which of course all added towards what was a quite heavy bike for a 125 at nearly 200 pounds. So despite its very lean looks, it needed to slim down a bit if it wanted to increase its speed on the racetrack. And on the ignition side of the engine, it was fitted with a PAL Magneton CDI electronic ignition unit to supply all its sparks, and this of course would be much more efficient and more reliable than those older points contact breaker ignitions that were fitted to the older CZ bikes of the past. And once again on the transmission side, and to complement that 6 speed gearbox. We have a standard wet multi-plate clutch that was worked very hard when this engine was in full flow, and you had to keep your feet dancing on that gearbox and slipping this clutch to try and get any kind of performance out of that anemic 125 power plant. But as you can see, our little 125 engine had a centre port exhaust type configuration, and our feature bike still appears to have most of its stock exhaust pipe still fitted, because there doesn't seem to be much evidence of track damage, as it looks pretty clear of any dings and dents that you normally associate with these front mounted expansion chambers. But again, this alloy tailpipe is still the self-same part that was fitted at the CZ HQ back in 1990, and actually we did try and get this bike to fire up after we took these video clips and pictures, although this bike's been mothballed for many years and hasn't been turned over for ages, but we did try our best to start her up, but she point blank refused to comply. Now, another quite weird piece of engineering on our 519CZ was this triple clamp to hold the front forks, which on any normal dirt bike would be a separate clamp for the top and another one for the bottom, which would usually be manufactured in alloy, although for some strange reason CZ have decided to make and cast both triple clamps as one big lump of metal and make it out of heavy steel, and they even cast 4 big steel pegs into this part to mount the bike's front number plate. But that was one of the very noticeable things about these 1990 CZ 125s. Many of the bike's smaller parts that other manufacturers would have made of light alloy or even magnesium to save weight, but CZ made them out of steel, which, as I said, all contributed to one of the heaviest 125s of its day. And so as we move on to the bike's front forks, which are Czechoslovakian CZ made units, which were about as basic as they come, and they offered next to no range of adjustment whatsoever, and some riders of that time even commented that these forks were barely good enough to support the weight of the bike while it was standing still, let alone put it on a racetrack. And one bike tester even said to avoid jumps, bumps and any other kind of terrain that was rougher than a snooker table, because these suspension units will either break or throw you off the bike, because they were that bad. But they were said to give the rider at least 12 inches of travel on this front end, but very few were brave enough to test them to see if that was the case. So in other words, if you were still quite keen enough to use your 519 125 as a fully blown motocross machine, then it would probably be best to remove these forks completely and then fit something with a bit more strength and quality before lining up on the start line. Now, unfortunately, the story of the bike's rear single monoshock really wasn't much better than the front end, because firstly, it had a steel body, a steel shaft and a steel reservoir, which despite it all being super heavy, it did very little to help keep that back end of the bike in check. And despite CZ in the past making decent twin shock and front end suspension units on their World Championship winning bikes of the 60s and 70s, these modern style monoshock units fitted onto these 1990 bikes are not even in the same ballpark as those older machines. But again, if you're still going to put the bike onto a racetrack, then it's probably best once more to change this for something much better and lighter. Now, moving on to the bike's front and rear stoppers, which on this front brake here were a twin pot hydraulic unit that certainly wouldn't stand the bike on its head if you grabbed a handful of front brake lever, but with plenty of notice beforehand, it would still help to slow the rotation of this front wheel if you had enough runway straight ahead. And this rear brake again was a twin piston caliper unit whose performance was about on the same par as the front brake, but looking at the actual size of both of these calipers, you just can't help wondering that they look far too big for just a small 125 bike. And of course, again, all that excess metal all adds towards making our little 125 about as heavy as an open class motocrosser. Although, to be fair to CZ, they did try and save a few micrograms of weight by not using a reservoir to hold the rear brake's hydraulic fluid, and they simply used this rubber tube with a cap on the top, which actually is quite a good idea on the face of it. So it just shows you it's not all doom and gloom on our 125. Surprisingly though, a plastic fuel tank on our CZ, which I think held around 8 litres of pre-mixed fuel, which was usually more than enough to keep that 125 two-stroke motor running smoothly. But again, CZ decided to fit a fuel tap on either side of the tank for reasons unknown to myself, but more unnecessary parts and weight added to our already fat 125 racer. But as I remember, the 519 had a small radiator on either side of the front frame down tube, and of course it also had these plastic radiator scoops on either side to try and help direct that oncoming air into the radiators to assist the cooling of the motor. But these scoops are remarkably similar to the Honda bikes of that period, but whether these actually did assist in the radiator cooling is unknown, although as all of the other bikes of that same period did have air scoops of one kind or another on their water-cooled machines. I suppose that CZ just had to follow suit. And these again were just held on to the tank and at the side of the radiators by 3 simple screws. But the remainder of the plastic parts that are bolted onto our 519 are all Czechoslovakian CZ designed and built parts, and by all accounts these did a decent job and could withstand the usual battering that's normally associated with motocross off-road bikes. But one thing is for sure, is that this front number plate's never ever going to fall off this bike, because it has its own mounting pegs cast into that Titanic forged triple clamp that has 4 very substantial bolts to hold it in place. So in terms of its security, this is about as rock solid as you could get on a front number plate. Now the CZ's seat certainly looks the part, and it appears to be comfortable and substantial enough to help the rider move his weight around that chassis. And as you can see, it creeps up to nearly the top of the tank's filler cap. But one thing you did have to watch out for on these 519s was that the fuel tap on this right hand side of the bike stuck out from the radiator scoop, and if you moved your weight too far forward on the bike, you could certainly hit the tap with your leg and stop the engine. So it was just another thing to remember when you were riding the bike. But most of the time you never really knew you had done it until, of course, the motor spluttered to a halt in the middle of the track. But moving on to the bike's controls, which are your basic Magura levers and their rubber covers, although I'm pretty sure that the handlebars on our bike here have been swapped at one time for these much more modern Renthals. And certainly more weight being added to the bike with this big alloy hydraulic fluid reservoir, and a handy engine kill switch has also been bolted onto the bars just in case of any problems with that 125 motor. But there was certainly no need to worry yourself in case you snapped open this gasser throttle too quickly, because despite that little compact 125CZ engine reputedly pushing out around the 30 horsepower mark, many of the ponies in that engine were posted missing, and it's even said that smaller 60 or 80cc two-stroke off-roaders could certainly pass this bike with ease while it was on the racetrack. But once more, the CZ designers could have saved themselves precious weight on our 125 by making this rear swing arm from alloy and not this heavy steel as we have here. And although this part would have undoubtedly be strong enough for a smaller 125 racer, but weight, as you know, is key when you're designing a light flickable 125 off-roader. And it appears that our swing arm here is made from two separate parts, with this quite ungainly welding down the middle of the join. Although when you step back and just take a look at these 519s, you have to admit that they certainly look the goods, and they're not the ugliest looking dirt bike on the planet. But then again, that's easy enough to say when the bike's just sitting here nicely propped up for photos. But the reality of these 125CZs were certainly a different story. And as I said, the chassis, it was okay, but it was still far too heavy for a little 125, when every single gram of weight for these screamers had to be kept to a minimum to make it easier to throw around a track. But the front and the rear suspension was only really good enough to hold the bike upright so that I could grab these pictures, and the forks and the rear suspension was of no use whatsoever on a motocross bike. And although I've personally not had the displeasure of riding one of these 519s, I know a couple of guys who did try one back in the day, and they commented that they hope to never get the opportunity to have another go, because the suspension and other parts on this bike were that bad. But with regards this 125 engine, which it has to be said, it was very well engineered and designed, although it was still badly underpowered even for a little 125. And there's also stories going around that when these engines had the old Jekov carburetors fitted onto them, that even then they struggled to get the motors fired up. But motocross bike tester, the world famous Jody Weissel, who tested this bike in the early 1990s, just about summed up our 519 CZ by saying, and I quote, "When you were riding this bike, it wasn't really racing at all, because it was so slow and heavy that you just watched the rest of the pack pull away from you and then disappear into the distance, and it was just a case of waiting until they came round again before becoming part of the race once more. But summing up, these 519s were certainly not a patch on those fantastic two-stroke World Championship winning machines that CZ turned out in the 1960s and 70s, when some of the world's top riders were fighting each other to sign up to race for the Czechoslovakian manufacturers. And as I said, these 519s were the very last throw of the dice for CZ to try and grab a piece of the modern motocross market. But the reality was that these bikes were just far too heavy and too slow to bring back those golden days of when Czechoslovakian two-strokers were the fastest machines in world motocross. Well, there you have it, another quite rare bike featured here on CDB TV, that 1990 CZ125 type 519 bike. As I said, the bike, it certainly did have the looks, but the overall performance of the machine was well below par, and certainly no competition whatsoever for the big four Japanese manufacturers. Right, so coming up next here on my video channel, we're going to take a look at this lovely 1981 RM125 Suzuki, and as you know, these little RM125s were Suzuki's first ever venture into water cooling of motocross machines, and this little bike here has been fully restored. So we'll be taking a look at this RM125 when we return to CDB TV. But until then, everybody out there, continue to be safe and well, and watch what you're doing when you're riding those old vintage dirt bikes. And I hope to see you back here again very soon to talk about more of this old school vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.